The Newburyport Literary Festival is a celebration of reading. People come both to hear well-known favorite authors and in hopes of discovering new ones. The poet Nausheen Eusuf has been a discovery for a great many readers in recent years. Her work has appeared in such high-end journals as the American Scholar and PN Review, arguably the best literary journal in the UK. Her poems have been chosen for the 2018 and 2019 editions of Best American Poetry. Her reading schedule has got her hopping from Philadelphia to New York to Boston. Next up is a reading at Robert Frost Farm in Derry. Everybody wants to hear her, and there's an urgency because she says she'll return to her native Bangladesh when she finishes her graduate degree work at BU. Nausheen traces her beginning as a poet to a eureka moment of her own. In high school, I was a physics buff rather than a literature enthusiast. In fact, I majored in computer science in college. During my last semester at Wellesley, however, I signed up for Frank Bidart's poetry workshop, kind of on a whim. I hadn't really written or studied poetry, but just hearing him read poetry was like a religious conversion. He reads with an intensity that almost makes you hold your breath. And I was hooked. It makes perfect sense to find out that Nausheen came to poetry through hearing it read aloud. To be sure, she'd laid the groundwork for that moment of discovery with some close listening earlier in life. Here's her loving evocation of her parents at the dinner table. Where are they now? Who regaled each other with the day's trivia at dinner each night, and you listened, not inclined to speak, the better to absorb the music of their speech. Just how deeply Nausheen is hooked on the sound of poetry is evident in the poems she's collected in her first book, not Elegy, but Eros. Take, for instance, her poem, Shining Shoes, a tribute both to her father and to the poet Robert Hayden. Or take her Ode to the Slow Life, a poem where she quotes passages from Yeats, Whitman, Marvell, and Bishop, bringing them into a poem so gorgeous on its own that it's hard to know which lines are the master's and which are hers. I think as time goes on, it's going to be still more difficult to make that distinction. Nausheen Eusuf.
Thank you so much, Alfred. I'm so delighted to be here, and this is just such a wonderful festival. I'm delighted to be reading with Maryann. Alfred, I didn't even remember telling you the story about, when did I even tell you? I don't remember, but that's amazing that you remembered it, about Bidart. So that's kind of awesome. Actually, a cool thing about Bidart, since I just love the man and I can't shut up about him, and now that you've opened up that vein, I'm actually on the record quoted in the Boston Globe as saying, that man, meaning Bidart, is a god. So this is one of my honors, is that I'm quoted on the record. And actually at this year's American Literature Association conference, which is happening in Boston, the Bishop and Lowell Societies are doing a tribute session, a tribute panel to Frank Bidart, and so they asked me to speak about his influence and mentorship, which is incredible for me to be able to do that. Anyway, so thank you for remembering that. Anyway, okay, we'll get started. The sorrows of the dead. The sorrows of the dead refuse to perish with their mortal masters. The griefs they grieved, the slights they bore, how can they not, once told, return to task the living, a collector at the door? You tend to them the way you water the plants that yellow regardless on the windowsill, the way regret unsettles like a feather on the windshield that turns, stalls, lies still, and disappears. Familiar, like old friends, like the loping gait of the three-legged cat that comes to your porch at dusk to find a bowl of milk. Surely you owe them that. This next poem is an elegy for my father, and as Alfred mentioned in his beautiful introduction, it's also a tribute to and inspired by Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. Shining shoes. Weekends growing up, I'd watch my father as he sat on a low stool in the veranda, surrounded by half a dozen pairs of shoes, their laces taken out, each meekly awaiting its turn. Facing him, assembled on a spread of old newspapers, the small round tins of kiwi shoe polish, its delicious smell, a couple of stiff bristled horsehair brushes, an old towel, and a couple of cloth rags, one damp, one dry. One by one, he'd hook each shoe gently in his left hand and work his right hand from toe to heel, first along one side, then turn it around for the other. Putting one down to dry, he'd pick up the next, then clean, brush, and buff until they shone like new. How loving each stroke. When my thankless teens intervened as they will, I withdrew from him, who continued to shine his shoes and go to work and put one foot in front of the other. That summer of my 18th year, as I hungered for new adventures elsewhere, I found him hunched in the half-dark hall, polishing a pair of leather sandals, mine. Now that he is 10 years gone, I recall how quiet was his love, how mute his farewell. The next poem I'm going to read is a poem that was, so this is the poem that's going to appear in this year's Best American Poetry. And the way I feel about that is sort of like if you write a poem about like a really horrible boyfriend you had, and then that poem goes on to win a prize, and you're like, okay, at least something good came out of it, you know, you feel vindicated. So I feel that way about the selection of this poem for the Best American Poetry 2019. And the guest editor is Major Jackson. I haven't seen him yet, but I was glad to see that he's on the program, so I'll get to introduce myself to him and say hello. Anyway, so this poem is about an experience of therapy. I tried therapy 4 or 5 years ago, not for the first time, not for the last time, unfortunately. And it was actually a psychoanalyst that I tried, although I was not like lying down on the couch. I was sitting. So the poem is called The Analytic Hour for that reason. Anyway, it was a terrible experience. I don't recommend it. Because the unfortunate thing is that therapy has the potential to heal, but it also has the potential to harm. And so this is about psychotherapy as an experience of estrangement and alienation rather than connection. The Analytic Hour. 1. A suspension in time, a pause, a parenthesis, a rarefaction, an ecstasis. The error in the script, an inscrutable other. Not Erlebnis, but Erfahrung, its frozen terror. The funhouse you feared with its jeering maze of mirrors where all reference reveals the uncongealed humors of its clowning tutelare. 2. To my right, the single window and oculus onto the world. A tiled roof, each tile gently overlapping the one below, hiding the nails, joints, seams, the structure that keeps the whole in place, armored against the elements. Above the neat row of houses, the contrails of a jet, its trail cleaving the sky. 3. What are you thinking? I could ask you the same, but to no avail. I am thinking of the window. Refulgence, luminosity, the grand fiat. The diaphanous curtains hung between the light and me, I who see but do not see. More light, for God's sake, more light. Let there be light. 4. I free associate, though nothing is free. Free, feral, ferris. A rusty outdoor faucet, the one that watered my mother's garden, its brass now weathered to bare green. The handle won't budge. A drop of water hangs vestigial from the stiff, rounded lip. 5. Who needs a garden? New spirits inhabit the stations of hearth and home. Take them. I give them to you. The clock avows the hour. Nothing happens. Nothing ever happens. An exercise in detachment, divestiture. I learn how not to need. So continuing on that dark note, and then I'll switch to lighter poems. This next poem was one that was commissioned. It's the only time I've written a commissioned poem. I'm from Bangladesh, as Alfred mentioned, and my hometown is Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh. And so there's a Dhaka Literary Festival. It's fairly new. It's only been around for 4 or 5 years. And so they participated in this program where 6 different literary festivals from around the world would each nominate a poet and a filmmaker, and then a poet from one of the places would get matched up with a filmmaker from another place, and the 6 poets through this scheme would be commissioned to write a poem. The theme was given, and the length was specified. So the theme was inheritance, however we want to interpret that. And when read out loud, the poem should be roughly 3.5 minutes in length, 3 to 3.5 minutes. So those were the only 2 stipulations. Was it should the theme is inheritance, and it should be about 3.5 minutes long. Now, and so I was paired up with this filmmaker from Croatia because one of the other literary festivals was in Croatia, and so he was going to make a 5-minute, and he did make a 5-minute short film to go with my reading of the poem. Anyway, so unfortunately, when the people from Bangladesh, from the Dhaka Literary Festival, contacted me, like the winter before last, they sort of caught me at a bad time when I was going through sort of this period of existential crisis. It's like, what's the meaning of anything? Why am I even alive? That sort of thing. So in that mind frame, I was thinking, okay, inheritance. All right, so what do we inherit? And like you already heard from the Shining Shoes poem, my father is deceased. Actually, both of my parents are deceased. So in a literal sense, I have come into my inheritance. But I thought, okay, what do we actually inherit from our parents? And it occurred to me that what we really, all of us, inherit from our parents is the human condition, It's like they suffered and died, and now we get to suffer and die, right? So it's like, thanks, Mom and Dad, like I really needed that. So that's what this poem's about. Inheritance. The premise is the wound to which we acquiesce. It brooks no dissent. The world wounds us into being. The past becomes a puzzle, street names lacking reference, the neighbors long gone, even the numbers obsolete. How was it that you arrived? Now you exist only in the present, ahistorical, like a needle spinning because it doesn't know the north. The molted form, the habitus, the lineaments, the selving and selvage, the ache of aliveness by which they abide. Without a history except the incarnate, the body a reliquary of the flesh, ancestral, familiar, uncanny the form that now becomes you. Who are you? Aren't you? Do I know you? Why be made only to be unmade anew? The world a simulacrum, layers of time and topos, reality and resemblance collapse into a final singularity. You search the garden bright with sunflowers and marigold, the jasmine tree that nightly wept its blossoms to the ground. Do they still now hold up the firmament like the old god condemned? And you, what burden will you bend to for eternity? The sad gaze that pleads, child, don't kill me, but you will, regardless. The facts are sordid. We find beautiful interpretations. You scavenge among remains, decades of books, papers, notes, photos, records, the effects of entire lives left behind, ciphers from another world, communicating what? If only there was a key, a portal, a trapdoor to the dead. My kingdom, child, my kingdom, I gave you all, and for what? Nothing, my lord. We enact our fate, the voices from the heath resounding forever in my ear, even the heavens unhinged with recrimination. Justly so. Whose was the tragic flaw? Whose the design? Everywhere you have ever been converges here on the sodden heath. The wind deigns no reply. The rehearsal of days and nights in the shadow theater of the mind, where the fancy disarticulates all chronology and causality. In the veranda, the day's wash flapped in the breeze or clung wetly to the rail, gathering the sun into armfuls by dusk, while the playthings, abandoned by evening, waited to be put away, having ranged the cosmos until dinner and bedtime beckoned. At night, the moonlight shreds the solace of your sleep, and morning returns, no matter how old the world. So I'm going to move on to a lighter note. So I'm a PhD student in English, which means I've had to read a lot of literary theory, unfortunately, which didn't make any sense to me, but it did give me material for poems. So one of the people I had to read, so like I'm talking about Derrida and Lacan and that sort of thing. So one of the people I had to read was Paul de Man, and I had to read this essay by Paul de Man, which I did not understand. And the essay was in English, but there was one line in it in French, and that French line jumped out at me. And the line is, "Ce comme n'est pas comme les autres," which means this like is not alike like the others. And I was like, now we're talking. So I ended up riffing on that line. So the poem is titled Like. The epigraph from Paul de Man, "Ce comme n'est pas comme les autres," this like is not alike like the others. Like. Indeed, perhaps it's a look-alike. A likely story, just like him, the little tyke, metaphors lesser kin, to sneak in when you're not looking. Some folks liken the two, but he's an imposter, a huckster. Just look in the OED, a lackluster monosyllable with 100 hues, and now on Facebook for those who like to click and click to like. I'm not on Facebook though. I like to take my liking slow. You can tell who's who by the things they like. Some like bikes and some like spikes. Some like geeks and some like freaks. But those are guises, each and all. The like you look, the like you sound, the likes of those you hang around. The good and bad you can't, the trippers and askers at every turn. The good and bad you can't discern. We are like as the waves, my dear. And I fear for you, my likeness, mon frère. This next poem was inspired by an article I read in the New York Times. And the article was about a group of psychiatrists and psychologists proposing a new diagnosis. And so this new diagnosis that they were proposing is basically the opposite of ADHD. So, kids who are hyperactive, they're ADD or ADHD. And the kids who are the opposite, they just kind of, they just like to stare out the window and daydream and kind of like, so that's considered, so they were proposing a new diagnosis for that. And so they were going to call it sluggish cognitive tempo, SCT. So as you can see, the range of normalcy is decreasing, right? So if you're on this end, you're ADD. If you're on this end, you're SCT, right? So, and I thought, well, if we can't stare out the window and daydream, what would happen to poetry, right? So this is called Ode to the Slow Life. And the epigraph from the New York Times article is called Sluggish Cognitive Tempo. The condition is said to be characterized by lethargy, daydreaming, and slow mental processing. Praise be to slowness, sloth, and indolence, to the lax, late, leisurely, and languorous, to idlers and whilers, dilatory and dolorous. To dallying lads and their dawdling lasses, to maids who tarry when they should marry, to vegetable love and thousand-year caresses. To the beggar, bum and deadbeat hobo, the moony romantic and dopey adolescent, the long-haired, pieced-out beatnik boho. To lazy Sundays and languid afternoons of dreamy divagations and useless fiddle with meddlesome words that ruse and riddle. To lean and loaf on the summer grass, to listen long and hard to the faintest air, to stitch and unstitch the hours that pass stretched out listless by brooks at noontide, where nothing happens, but something abides. So when I wrote this poem, like about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I showed this to one of my housemates who likes reading my poems. And so she was like, oh, I love this poem. You have such a way with words. You know, I love stitch and unstitch the hours. And I was like, oh, well, that's not me, that's Yeats. And then she's like, oh, and this one's brilliant. I love to lean and loaf on the summer grass. And I was like, that's not me either, that's Whitman. And then I was like, what about these lines? Do you like these lines? These are me. So chances are, if you liked something, it probably wasn't me. So I'm going to read 2 more poems. The next poem was inspired by Maryann Moore's The Pangolin. And I had never heard of pangolins before I came across the Maryann Moore poem, so I don't want to assume that. So basically a pangolin is a scaly anteater. It's an anteater with scales on the outside. And so the way it works, the way it defends itself, protects itself from predators is if it feels threatened by a predator, it rolls itself into a ball, and once it's rolled into a ball, only the scales are on the outside, so basically nothing can get through. So that's how it protects itself. And so the reason Maryann Moore is writing about pangolins is not because she's really interested in pangolins, but because it's a metaphor for human beings and psychological armoring. So that's really kind of the point. And it made me think of how the person I love used to be a pangolin once upon a time, an armored creature once upon a time, until I came along, of course. So this is To a Pangolin. Affection is an effort for the armored. No wonder, then, that the scaly pangolin inhabits an order by itself, the Pholidota. But what if one dotes on such a thing? Folly, no doubt. But I was unschooled in such matters, only a smitten amateur. Snout snug in a novel, you hardly noticed. When approached, you'd curl into a ball, aloof and inscrutable. What manners! Disgraceful! I couldn't tell head or tail. Piqued with the child's curiosity, I poked and prodded the queer little creature. Can armor defeat amour that conquers all? I was no more the enemy than an army of ants. I was unarmed, just enamored. So I waited until it cautiously unrolled and met my gaze, disarmed and startled, my enchanting anteater, my doting Pholidota. This last poem is also a creature poem, and it's a dog poem. And normally when I go to a poetry reading and somebody says they're going to read a dog poem, or it doesn't matter, it could be a cat poem, rabbit poem, doesn't matter. And the thing is, I'm not crazy about that, because I'm not crazy about the genre of pet poems, because no matter how special that pet is to the owner of that pet, the rest of us don't have any relationship with it. So, and we might not even be dog people or whatever, or rabbit people, so we can't really appreciate it. So I assure you, my dog poem is not about dogs. Just like Maryann Moore's pangolin poem is not really about pangolins, right? So, I'm not a dog person, I don't have a dog, I've never really had a dog, I'm not, so the dog is really a metaphor, the dog is actually, me, so, okay. And you have to imagine the poem from the dog's perspective, so it's like down here. So, looking up at the world from this height. The love of dogs. Of leash-tugging, hydrant-scenting walks past grown-ups with baby strollers and kids who stop to say, "How cute!" But he's more than a pair of floppy ears and a pink tongue. He's a mutt with a mission, a secret agent, a nose-to-the-ground sleuth on the trail. Every mailbox, tree, and lamppost is a clue. How could you possibly comprehend the midnight prowls and muffled growls and errant strangers and errant dangers that only he discerns? He's onto something. He barrels downstairs. A burglar? A break-in? No, the paper boy, a scratch behind the ear. You want to laugh, but something stops you. The eloquence of wet-nosed canine kisses slathered up your throat. The soughing of his breath as he sighs in his sleep. Thank you so much.
Well, do you see what I mean about Nausheen Eusuf? She's so terrific. Our next reader is Maryann Corbett, who spent 35 years working for the Minnesota legislature in the office of the Reviser of Statutes. Here is how she describes the straitjacket of legalese her writing had to wear all those years. Ours is a stunted language, unmouthed, rarely licked into life. In it, one may not exclaim, wonder, or boast. Laughter is illicit, poetry impossible. No wonder she has experienced such an outburst of creativity since leaving that position. In the last dozen years, Corbett has authored 4 books of poetry, the third of which, Medieval, won the 2014 Richard Wilbur Award. I'm translating medieval poems as well, she tells us. I concentrated at first on Old English, and I do love it best, but I'm also exploring Old Occitan, the language of the troubadours, and Middle French. Clearly, she cannot get enough of language, real spoken language, words that break into song, hymns of praise, professions of faith riddled with doubt. Clearly, language is her element. She lives in it. She feels its current on her skin, its heat and its cold, ever alert to the power of spoken language to elevate or to discourage. A poem titled Concealed Carry notes that all of us carry concealed weapons, capable of inflicting harm, the tongues in our mouths. We never know what triggers we might pull. She's not talking about insults or malicious gossip, but something as innocent as talking proudly about your grandchildren. It's acid in the face of the woman down the aisle, still empty-armed. In another poem, a child she meets on the street asks anxiously whether she is going back to school. When the poet says with a chuckle, "No, I've had enough of schooling," the boy fretfully insists, "But you have to. Finish, and find a job, and pay the landlord." And she realizes he is repeating something heard at home. She is hearing, "Woe, not meant for my ears." A Catholic poet at a time when that's not an easy thing to be, she ably mimics the diction and syntax of that most famous of Catholic poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, in a poem that paints the Supreme Being as a child in his terrible twos stage, giggling delight while crackhead comets steer headlong at little worlds. It is a convincing portrait, but like a good Catholic, she recants in the poem's closing lines, "No, this is all error, but it helps me come to terms." Note how cleverly she defends what she has written even as she takes it back. For a poet who so delights in language, coming to terms is the whole shebang. Maryann Corbett.
Thank you, Alfred, for that marvelous introduction. Thank you all for being here. First of all, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. And thank you, Nausheen, for those very fine poems and for being willing to join me in this endeavor. Some of you here already know, the basic shape of my life in poetry as Alfred described it, that I wrote it very early as a teenager and then I left it alone for 30 years because the plan was to become a scholar, a medievalist. I wanted to be teaching Beowulf and Chaucer and the history of the English language, and I duly got the master's and the doctorate to enable me to do those things. And then I couldn't find a job. And I went to work, as Alfred told you, with the Minnesota legislature in the revisor's office, which is a place that drafts bills and rules and session laws and edits all the state's books. And I taught lawyers how to mean one thing and just one thing in what they were writing, how to untangle their sentences so that they were not 20 yards long. And I spent, as Alfred told you, 35 years doing that. I came back to poetry just a little bit before I was able to retire, in about 2005. I was very, very lucky at that time to find the online poetry forum, Erratosphere. And I'm glad and grateful that some of you who are the powwow poets were active then on that poetry board. And I want to remember in this particular moment that I got special encouragement from Timothy Murphy, who passed away last year, whom many of us miss. When you're away from poetry for about 30 years, you have a lot of memories to mine. You have a backlog, shall we say. So, predictably, I will begin with that sort of poem. Sting of a memory, roused from its coils in the roots of the Latin, raising my voice to my teacher right there in the hallway. I lost it. My grip on the weave of the grammar, the veiled indirectness, footnotes. Red-faced, incensed at her hint that not all of the weeping was Dido's. Calling Aeneas a jerk and a rat, almost shouting that duty, piety, vows to the gods were all lies. And her face, and her eyebrows, bristly and white and just visible under the edge of a wimple, knitting. Then both of us suddenly silent, the bell, and then moving stone-faced toward chemistry class, while across on the opposite stairwell, slouching, a certain young perfidus carefully stared at his loafers. A lot of those memories I'm mining have to do with parenting. In fact, I started writing the poems just at the point when both children were off to college and I was suddenly not as needed as I had been. It was an impetus, shall we say. And with regard to those poems, I like Kay Ryan's remark that poems are like pearls. They generally begin with an irritation. And I find it's true for me that discomfort births quite a number of poems. It certainly birthed this one. Holiday Concert. Forgive us. We have dragged them into the night in taffeta dresses, in stiff collars and ties, with the wind damp, the sleet raking their cheeks. To school lunchrooms fitted with makeshift stages where we will sit under bad fluorescent lighting on folding chairs, and they will sing and play. We will watch the first grader with little symbols, bending her knees, hunched in concentration while neighbors snickered at her ardent face. Forgive us. We will hear the 7th grade boy as his voice finally loses its innocence forever at the unbearable solo moment, and know that now, for years, he will wince at the thought of singing, yet will ache to sing in silence. Silence even to the generation to come, with its night, its sleet, its hideous lunchroom chairs. That same rule about poems coming from irritation is equally true from poems written from the perspective of the child. And since they always say that you should try out your newer poems at readings as well as your tried and true ones, I will read you a newer one. Ghazal for a Bottle of Shalimar, 1956. The clear amber scent in its bottle, its glint from the top of the vanity. Cut crystal flutes with a frosted glass stopper catching the sun on her vanity. The glamorous dreams of our mother, unspoken to curious children, were sharp as the quarter moon curve of that bottle enshrined on the vanity. What were they guarding? What secrets? And how would a child understand them? And what was I thinking, small magpie lured on by the glitter of vanity? Wreckage of beauties, the spill, the wet, the gray film on the rosewood. I was the firstborn, the first to drive thorns through the heart of her vanity. Painfully, mothers forgive. On the mountain with 7 stories, how long will the granite of penitence weigh on the spine of my vanity? And what do my children remember? What hauntings by anger and tears does my memory hide from itself in the metal-bound chest of my vanity? 60 years on, and the stain-mottled dresser now broods in my bedroom, breathing regret and my name, and the words of the preacher, vanity. So as you see, I have a tendency to accentuate the negative in these poems, and sometimes I need to make a special, particular effort to dig into joyful things and remember those. And that's what I was doing when I wrote this next one, which is the title poem of my second book, Credo for the checkout line in winter. And this will work best for you if you call to mind what it's like to be in the checkout line and what you see in that particular environment. Even while sleep spits in the parking lot, and a bored girl with a tongue stud and fuchsia hair rings up these tasteless, stone-hard, gassed tomatoes. Even now, I believe with perfect faith in the rounded, fragrant heirloom types to come. In covered farmers' markets where flats of pansies spread in uncountable rows, their petals trembling all over, exactly the way it felt once, new, shucked from tucks and tulle, sprung from our childhoods, rocketing into new lives, our possessions wagging behind us, crammed in a 12-foot U-Haul with a governor and no radio, belting John Denver at the tops of our lungs for 1,100 miles of farmland stippled green. And on the third day, we came, gravel-throated and bone-jarred to the place appointed. A stony hole in the ground gaped where a street should go in front of our building, and we lugged our laden dressers across the blocks through air gritty with seasonal road construction, not faltering even then. And 40 years of falling on stony ground still see us springing for Aprils. And therefore, I believe in the future of the geeky bagger who never meets my eyes, but will someday win the smile of the pink-haired cashier. In palms, as they beckon to me from glossy covers that sway over swimwear that conquers the laws of physics. In Elvis, who will return in a blaze of sequins to burn away all sorrow, yea, though he tarry. Now, after a long period of mining one's own life and brain, sometimes one says to oneself, God, my life is boring, and one needs to get out of it. One of the most effective ways of getting out of it is translation. And since I spent all those years studying Old and Middle English, I naturally gravitated to those sources for translation material. Often I would find that 1,000-year-old poems would seem strangely timely, like this one, which is from the Exeter Book collection of Old English riddles. And this is one that I worked on in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. From the third storm riddle, subtitled by me, Hurricane. Sometimes, working at the world's surface, I must roil waves, must wrangle currents, to force the floodwaters' flint-gray spates back at the beaches. Spray-flecked breakers whack the walls of cliffs. The water dimly beneath them heaves. The deep is a mountain looming. Lurking in its wake, mud-churned, murky. Another one moves, so that soon these breach the high-ground barriers of shore. Now ships groan, their hulls shattered. Creaking of keels and cries of seamen mix with the idiot moaning of the wind. Above, standing staunchly, the steep stone walls wait for the water, for high, hard waves in hammering swells to crush them. What chance for pleasure craft, their hands that guests in that ghastly time, if the sea scoop them and scour and smash their runners away. Bereft, wretched, they buck on the back of the storm-winged beast. Of the many miseries I make known to men, this is one merely. A master I must serve, stern in my purpose. Who can still him? I wanted to make my third book, Medieval, into a sort of homage to the time I spent studying those old poems poems. So there are several such translations in that book, along with poems about the way medieval things echo in modern life. But also in that book are a few poems about my working life in the legislature, which was hard to write about while I was working there because most of what we did was covered by the requirements of confidentiality and nonpartisanship. I couldn't take a stand publicly on any issue, lest I be perceived as not dealing well with those from the opposite side. So there was a lot I couldn't say. But it was safe to write this next poem, which was born out of our biannual project of reviewing Supreme Court opinions for the court's occasional statement that some particular law was unconstitutional or ambiguous or in need of the legislature's attention. That sort of project calls for a lot of reading of cases. And case law is sad. Its situations are difficult. So there's this, a volume of cases. The stiff sewing choirs, the buckram cover, the meth abuse, the absent mother, the prepaid phones that called each other, the home foreclosed, the groaning debt, the liabilities offset, the punch thrown in the bar, the threat, the dry recitals where and when, the last appeals of dying men, the sentence to be parsed again, the deference, the court's respect, the reasoning it must reject, the lives behind the pages, wrecked, the pieces that will not align, the silent matters they decline, the gold impressed into the spine. My most recent book is called Street View, and it's largely about public places, most of them local to me, but sometimes traveling whacks me over the head and hits me with a poem. And this poem was born of a trip I took to read with the Women Poets Timeline and with Carmine Street Metrics back in 2014, and I went to New York City. And Rena, you were there when we did that reading, and you said to me, if you don't love New York, you're dead. Not being dead, I wrote a slightly defective ode to the West Side Y, a visit to New York with apologies to Percy Shelley. Oh, noble entry on West 63rd, whose image beckons from the internet in brownstone arches, breathing not a word of shared baths, skimpy towels, and toilette too redolent of doors back in the day. Oh, great location, frugal nightly net of rate plus tax. Oh, bright five-starred array in blandishments, ratings that claim I'll cop a tidy bargain for my 3-night stay. Oh, plain and simple, nothing over the top. Yo, West Side Y, I'm talking, listen up. Which seems to be the more appropriate phrasing, since all this O is more than slightly twee, but I digress. Done with the eyeball-glazing non-stop to JFK from NSP, I'm here, admitted to your inner sanctum, lugging my wheelie toward the mystery. The clerk has offered me my key. I've thanked him. Clueless within the labyrinth, I wander. Those fantasies I had, they're gone. You yanked them, oh dim halls, clanking radiator thunder, archaic carpets, dark with ground-in gum, wet bathroom floors. Later that night, I pondered the howls of student athletes having fun. I fantasize about a loaded gun. But morning, look to the right and Lincoln Center gleams like the castles of Les Trélicheurs, while opposite, the seasons turned inventor of pointillist impressionism, a blur in jonquil and forsythia. Magnolias and calorie pears and redbuds all concur. Winter is over. Several cardinal scolas chant early alleluias to the frou-frous of Central Park. The human centifolias, the garden social registers and who's who's. Temperatures saunter toward the 70s and marathoners blossom in pink tutus, crossing at the museum. There's a breeze. What jaded critic sulks at arts like these? So it's a wash, dear wine. No, it's a steal. How can I whine about the noisy nights and soggy floors when all New York's more real now than it was? Look, when a poet writes, West Broadway glitters in a mist of rain, I know now, with exactness, how the lights conjure that disillusion in his brain, and yellow cabs whoosh past him, 3 and 4 abreast. An image trumps a bulky drain. It plants Manhattan in the deep heart's core, a solidness I didn't own before, which is the reason I'll be flying back some spring to come to start the day on Broadway, andante, in the Starbucks line, and take my almond Danish and my steaming latte under the gold-green trees at 63rd, to sip beneath the measured gaze of Dante. Yes, I'm Midwestern, fashion senseless, stirred too slowly for this town's up-tempo zing, fuddled by subways, gawking and absurd. But coming back, in spite of everything, wired up and giddy as this longed-for spring. And I ought to end right there, it being so seasonal, but this is about endings, and I'll finish with this. State Fair fireworks, Labor Day. Look up. Blazing chrysanthemums in rows shriek into bloom above the tilt-a-whirls, hang for a blink, then die in smoky swirls. They scream revolt at what the body knows. All revels end. We clap and sigh. Then, no, another rose, another peony, break, flame, roar, as though by roaring they might make the rides whirl in perpetuum. As though we need not finally wearily turn to plow back through the crush of bodies, the lank air, to buses that inch us sweating across town. As though we were not dropped in silence there to trudge the last blocks home, the street lamps low, the crickets counting summer's seconds down. Thank you very much.